Well, as I mentioned at the top of the program, a United Nations agency is seeking to control social media and online communications. Well, they unveiled a censorship plan that would involve government agencies, regulatory authorities, and even the platforms themselves. The UN's Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, would have authority to, this is the proposal they're putting forward, it would give them the authority to govern communications worldwide, despite being compromised by leadership that includes, multiple members of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the United States exited UNESCO under both the Reagan and Trump administrations for obvious reasons. But the Biden administration not only rushed to rejoin the agency, it has also already implemented many of its policies on U.S.-based platforms. How can we prevent the weaponization of pseudo-experts and bureaucrats deeming anything they find inconvenient or they don't like just because it runs counter to what they're claiming when they call it disinformation? How do we combat that? Joining me now to discuss this and more is Scott Shepard, director of the Free Enterprise Project at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Scott, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thanks so much, Tony. Great to be with you as always.
Well, thanks so much for taking time to join us. Let's start by giving an overview of UNESCO, which the U.S., as I mentioned, exited during Reagan and Trump's administration. Biden administration rushing right back in.
Oh, well, and of course the Biden administration would rush right back in because UNESCO pushes all of the whole of government initiatives that the Biden administration pushes. It pushes, and the UN generally pushes, decarbonization on completely impossible, politicized schedules that would result in attendees at the UN and at the Davos World Economic Forum conference and their pals being able to keep their private jets and become a global class of nobility while the rest of us live ever more constrained lives. They're the people who run the WHO, the World Health Organization, that lied and lied and lied about the pandemic and the lockdowns and got everything wrong. And that now we see also supports censorship in the name of making the world's communication system safe and healthy, but that are really designed to label as hate anything that supports freedom or opposes globalism, and stripping that out of public discourse. Happily, that's wildly unconstitutional, but as we've seen time and again, the Biden administration and the Constitution aren't really kissing cousins.
So, Scott, I mean, we've seen for years all kinds of garbage come out of the United Nations, but as you mentioned, the World Health Organization, we've been focusing on what they're projecting to become the pandemic police. How serious should we take this threat from UNESCO?
Oh, I think it's freedom threatening and civilization threateningly serious, because they explicitly, in their discussions about these plans, they explicitly and repeatedly talk about interfering with elections, talk about this UN body being the body that gets to decide what constitutes proper fact and what's conspiracy theory or misinformation or disinformation. And remember, as we just said, the UN's wrong about everything all the time. They were wrong about the pandemic. They were wrong about the lockdowns. They were wrong about the vaccines. They're wrong about the effects of carbon on the atmosphere and climate, which is not to say that there's no global warming, but there's not much, and it's just fine, and we're going to get by with it just fine, except that they get their funding from convincing us that there's some lunatic crisis and then controlling the results. And in discussing these censorship plans, the organization talked about pandemic response as though they fully expect there to be more pandemics,
right.
Wherein they get to shut down the world. It's genuinely terrifying all the way down.
Yeah, I can't point to one thing that the United Nations has done properly or well. And you look at this, and it is indeed a threat to freedom. When you have governments, leftist governments, left-leaning governments like our own, they use these provisions of the United Nations to say, well, look, we got to do it. The rest of the world is doing it. So they voluntarily fall into it, and I think that's the purpose of these things.
Forgive me that, Tony. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's funny to see when what Europe does or what the world does is important and when it isn't.
Right.
It's important that Europe was ahead of us in driving into the decarbonization ditch. But as they pull away from it, then Europe doesn't matter anymore. Europe matters when it's to the left of us on social issues, but when it's far to the right on social issues, as many of the maximalist abortion states, then suddenly the European system of 12 or 15 or 20-week limits just doesn't matter anymore. So you're absolutely right. It's a foil used by leftist American governments to try to get around the American Constitution when the world's to the left of us. When the world's to the right of us, it doesn't matter anymore. And somehow the avatar of American liberty is leading further toward the leftism that's the antithesis of the American idea.
Right. We've seen that on so many issues. You mentioned abortion. We've seen it on the transgender issue and the surgeries. A lot of Europe moving away from that, saying, hey, this is not a good idea. But the United States, the Biden administration, no, they're still going headlong into it. Scott, thanks so much for joining us. Always great to see you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thank you so much, Tony.
All right. Take care.